Hey everyone, John Reed here from Learn to Stargaze and author of 110 Things to See with a Telescope, 50 Things to See with a Telescope for Kids, the new book Learn to Stargaze, and several other books as well. In this video, I'm going to review how to use every type of beginner telescope in 10 simple steps. This is Learn to Stargaze. Be sure to watch until the end of the video where I show you how to use a robotic telescope for free over the internet to take photos like this and this and this. Tip number 1, know what type of telescope you're using and what it's been designed for. Okay, I'm going to be calling these telescopes by their nicknames, so don't go blaming me in the comments if you don't like it. I'm just calling it as it is. The first and most popular type of telescope is nicknamed the Planet Killer. These are long focal length refractors designed for naturally high magnification. They're perfect for your first view of the rings of Saturn, the cloud belts and moons of Jupiter, and craters on the moon. Refractors are telescopes that collect light using a lens located at the front of the optical tube. Examples of these telescopes include the Celestron Astromaster 70AZ, the Explorer Scientific Gemini 2, and the Explorer First Light Refractor with a focal length of 1,000 millimeters. Note that high magnifications make finding deep sky objects like star clusters and nebula more challenging. Related to the Planet Killer is the Mighty Mac. These tiny telescopes generally have even longer focal lengths than the planet-killing refractors. Small Maksutov telescopes achieve these high focal lengths using a series of mirrors to compress the light path into this compact package. These highly portable telescopes are great for viewing the moon and planets. Mighty Mac telescopes are often used for deep sky objects too, but they're typically attached to motorized mounts to help you find and track your targets, because as I said, high magnification makes finding targets challenging. Large Newtonians like this Dobsonian are known as light buckets. Newtonians use a large mirror at the back of the tube to collect light. Light collection and resolution are the most important attributes of a telescope, and these improve with aperture, the size of the mirror. Newtonian telescopes, specifically Dobsonians, are designed to collect the most light and provide the highest resolution at the lowest cost. This telescope collects almost 20 times as much light as one of those planet-killing telescopes, but its large size can be a disadvantage. Then there are these scopes, the Hobbykillers. According to telescope expert Ed Ting, the PowerSeeker 127 EQ is the most hated telescope on the market today. This would apply to the PowerSeeker 70 EQ as well. The reason that these telescopes are named Hobbykillers is primarily due to the low quality of the equatorial mount. Even if you align it perfectly, the gears will often come loose or the mount will pivot left and right in a way that it shouldn't, which kills your alignment. Credit for the name Hobbykillers, I believe, comes from Sky and Telescope magazine. They're referencing these long focal length telescopes on equatorial mounts, but the term Hobbykiller can also apply to telescopes that have been Bird-Jonesed as well. This includes the PowerSeeker 127 EQ and the StarSense LT114. When people say Bird-Jones, they're typically referring to an extra lens placed into the focusing assembly of these small Newtonian telescopes. These lenses double the focal length of the telescope, but seem to drastically reduce the optical performance. That said, these telescopes perform reasonably well on the moon and planets, assuming you can successfully get the telescope pointed in the right direction. These used to be called department store telescopes, but these days they're found all over the internet. Next, we have short tube telescopes. Short tube refractors and reflectors are one of my favorite beginner telescopes, assuming they have at least 4 inches of aperture and are placed on simple AZ mounts. Short tube telescopes typically have focal ratios between 4 and 7. Focal ratio is focal length divided by aperture. A good example is the Celestron Omni 102AZ, which I believe is only found at Costco these days. Other short tube refractors include the Skywatcher Star Travel 102 at f5 and the Celestron Inspire 102 at f6.5. Examples of short tube reflectors include the Celestron 130 SLT at f5 and for kids the Explorer Scientific 114 at f4.3. Short tube telescopes are typically very easy to use because of their naturally wide fields of view. They offer great views of the moon, planets, double stars, and bright star clusters from the city, and are more than capable of capturing hundreds of deep sky objects from dark skies. The downside to short tube refractors is some chromatic aberration when viewing bright targets like Jupiter. Then there are the workhorses of amateur astronomy. These are known as the CATs. The CATs are catadioptric telescopes, which include the Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope like this C8. CATs are known for their multi-purpose role, excelling at both planets and deep sky objects. Advanced astrophotographers use these telescopes for capturing close-up images of galaxies. These telescopes typically come at a premium for their given aperture and are mostly found on motorized mounts. A notable exception is the Celestron DX5, which uses Celestron's cell phone-powered StarSense Explorer system. Despite the cost, CATs are incredibly popular beginner telescopes that provide a lifetime of enjoyment for the amateur astronomer. And finally, we have the Bird Feeder Telescope. These are often marketed as kids' telescopes, but they're clearly not designed for looking at anything in the sky. This is pretty much as high as it goes. Telescopes designed for looking at space also need to track objects as they move across the sky. Typically, this can be done with a light touch on the optical tube or using the slow motion controls. Here's an example of an actual kid's telescope. Look at how easily it moves. Bird feeder telescopes, like the Celestron Travelscope, lack this ability. They're fitted to camera tripods and are designed to point at just one spot, like a bird feeder. They also lack the 90-degree diagonal required for looking at things in the sky. They come with a 45-degree diagonal designed for looking at things on Earth. As for optical performance, it's not horrendous, but binoculars would be a far better alternative. Not all the telescopes mentioned in this section are telescopes that I would recommend. For a full, unbiased list of recommended beginner telescopes at every price point, visit learntostargaze.com. Tip number 2. Know how your telescope orients the image. There are 3 primary ways that a telescope will display the image in the eyepiece. There's mirror reversed, there's upside down, which is really just a 180-degree rotation, and there's image erect. And this surprises a lot of people. Newtonians, for example, rotate the image by 180 degrees, making objects appear upside down. Some people see this and think their telescope is broken. Most refractors and CATs show an image that's mirror reversed. Some beginner telescopes include what's called an erecting diagonal. This diagonal uses a prism instead of a mirror to direct light into the eyepiece so that the image appears, well, normal. Tip number 3. Know how to align your finder to the telescope. There are several types of finders that come on beginner telescopes. The best type of finders these days are bullseye finders, which project an illuminated bullseye onto the sky. The next best thing is the red dot finder, which projects a red dot. Just remember to have extra 2032 batteries on hand, as these finders often get left on. And finally, there's the old-fashioned finder scope, also known as a finder telescope. Some finder telescopes invert the image, which can be extremely confusing for beginners. Regardless of what type of finder you have, it will need to be aligned to the telescope so that the finder and the telescope are pointed at exactly the same spot. This is most easily accomplished during the day using a distant object. First, get a distant object centered in the telescope, then use the knobs or adjustment screws to center the finder. Move back and forth between the finder and the telescope to make sure that the finder and the telescope are pointed at exactly the same spot. If you find this video helpful, hit the subscribe button below to get the most out of your stargazing experience. Tip number 4. Know what eyepiece to use and when to use a Barlow. In general, most beginner telescopes come with 2 eyepieces, and sometimes they include a Barlow. With eyepieces, it's really important to understand that low magnification is best for searching for targets. In fact, in most cases, your telescope's lowest magnification is the best magnification to use most of the time. Note that increasing magnification does not increase resolution. Objects may appear closer, but they won't look better. In fact, your telescope has a maximum useful magnification. This is twice the telescope's aperture in millimeters or 50 times the aperture in inches. For example, this 102mm telescope will have a maximum useful magnification of 204 times. In general, exceeding the telescope's maximum useful magnification makes objects look worse. But how do you find your telescope's magnification in the first place? Well, magnification is the focal length of the telescope divided by the focal length written on the eyepiece multiplied by any Barlows you happen to be using. Most of the time, you shouldn't be using a Barlow anyway. I often keep mine hidden in a drawer. That way, I don't accidentally use it when I shouldn't. If your telescope came with 2 eyepieces, the one with the longer focal length, usually around 25mm, is the one you'll use most often. This eyepiece provides the lowest magnification. Use it to find your targets and for viewing deep sky objects like star clusters, galaxies, and nebula. To use the eyepiece, put it in a diagonal if you're using a refractor, or focuser if you're using a Newtonian. Point the telescope at a bright object and turn the focusing knobs until the object is in focus. Be sure to practice during the day. If you're pointed at a star, focus is reached when that star is as small as possible. To zoom in on a planet like Jupiter, first find and identify the planet with the lowest powered eyepiece. Then zoom in by switching to a higher powered, lower focal length eyepiece. Be sure to refocus the telescope after switching eyepieces. To make a planet appear larger, first make sure the planet is centered in the eyepiece. Then quickly remove the eyepiece, put a Barlow between the eyepiece and the telescope, then refocus the telescope and recenter the planet. Before moving on to a new target, be sure to remove both the Barlow and the high-powered eyepiece, returning the low-powered eyepiece to the telescope, and then refocus. Now, a popular stargazing accessory is the zoom eyepiece, which you just twist to zoom in. Just remember to refocus the telescope when you adjust the magnification. Tip number 5, become an expert at using your mount. The mount is the most important part of your observatory and the most important part of the telescope itself. Let's talk about basic altazimuth mounts first. These are mounts that move up and down and left and right. Sometimes these mounts come with slow motion controls and sometimes they don't. In either case, the telescope should be loose enough so that you can move it left and right and up and down with a simple push of the tube, but it should be tight enough to stay exactly where you put it when you let go. Most slow motion controls let you move the telescope all the way up and all around. Be aware that some slow motion control designs, like those on the Skywatcher Star Travel, limit the movement of these controls, and they must be reset to a central position after the telescope has moved a few degrees. This Celestron Astromaster 70AZ has a panhandle mount. To lock this telescope's up-down axis, turn the handle clockwise and counterclockwise to loosen the axis. This is a rod and yoke mount. These mounts can be tricky to use, but you should still be able to move the telescope up and down and left and right with a slight push on the tube. This little knob is a slow motion control for the up-down axis, but it must be reset after the telescope has moved up or down a few degrees. This is your basic equatorial mount. It's designed so that following your target across the sky can be accomplished by turning this right ascension knob. However, getting the telescope set up to do this correctly can be a challenge. Now, I've got a detailed video on how to set up this type of mount, but most importantly, what you need to do is get this right ascension axis pointed directly at the north celestial pole, if you live in the northern hemisphere. And you have to do this while the telescope is in its home position, like this. And if you live in the northern hemisphere, the north celestial pole is approximately at the location of the North Star. Use these two stars in the cup of the Big Dipper and follow them over to the North Star like this. These mounts can be a challenge because you can't just push the telescope over to your target. You have to move the telescope along the two axes. This axis, called declination, moves the telescope toward or away from the celestial pole. This axis, called right ascension, moves the telescope around the celestial pole. Now, if you can get the North Star centered in the finder scope while the telescope is like this in the home position, that's good enough for basic visual observing. Motorized mounts serve two purposes. First, help you find objects in the sky by slewing the telescope directly to the target, and second, tracking that target as it moves across the sky. The challenge with these mounts is that you have to align the telescope to the sky each night by going through the mount's alignment procedure. Generally, this is done by following the instructions on the hand controller. Basically, the telescope will have you input your time, date, and location, and then have you slew the telescope to 3 bright objects. Now, there are apps that help you do this as well. For example, Celestron Sky Portal connects to the NextStar mount with this adapter and allows you to complete the alignment process using the Sky Portal app. Push-to systems lie between motorized go-to mounts and completely manual mounts. The most popular push-to system is the Celestron StarSense Explorer series. This system uses the camera on your phone to orient the telescope to the sky. Once you've chosen a target within the StarSense app, the app will tell you which way to push the telescope to find your target. Then you'll manually use the slow motion controls to track the object as it moves across the sky. Tip number 6, practice during the day, but remember not to look at the sun. Now, I can't stress this enough. I get so many messages from people asking for advice on how to use their telescopes. Practicing during the day solves several issues that you might otherwise encounter during the night. It's also a great way to learn about new gear while you can see clearly. If you plan on taking pictures through your telescope, it's also a great time to practice that as well. To practice, make sure you can see an object about 1,000 feet away. Test each eyepiece and each eyepiece Barlow combination. Notice how the image changes between each eyepiece. How much larger does the image appear? Does the eyepiece have a wide field of view or is it small? Does the field of view change when you add the Barlow? How does the Barlow affect the quality of the image? These are all questions best answered during the day. Tip number 7. Dark skies are key to seeing galaxies and nebula. Astrophotographers have filled our eyes with images of colorful nebula and swirling clusters of galaxies. Humans have sent spacecraft to the planets, sending back incredible images both from orbit, via flybys like in the case of Pluto, and from the surface of planets like Mars, Venus, and Jupiter's moon Titan. When we get our first backyard telescope, sometimes I think our expectations can be a little too high for what we're realistically able to see. And unfortunately, the human eye is just not all that sensitive, and the resolution of your telescope is limited. When you look into a telescope, you won't see the vivid color in nebula, and galaxies will just look like gray smudges, even from the darkest skies. That's just the way it is. Now on a dark, moonless night, nebula might look like this, or this, or this. But you'll need to adapt your eyes to the dark to see them. And most of the time, you'll need to be miles away from the glow of city lights. When it comes to gear, I like to view galaxies and nebula using my lowest powered eyepiece. And I never use a Barlow on these targets. Sometimes experimenting with increased magnification with a quality eyepiece can improve the view of a galaxy or nebula, but it's almost always easier to find the targets using your lowest magnification. Now, assuming your telescope has sufficient aperture and quality optics, and your skies are dark enough, galaxies may look like this, or even this. Now, one exception is the Andromeda Galaxy, which takes up such a large portion of the sky that it actually looks better in binoculars. Now, I can't really stress this enough. The darkness of your sky is far more important than your telescope. Even having the moon in the sky is more than enough to hide most of the galaxies and nebula that would otherwise be visible from your dark sky location. For your best chance of viewing galaxies and nebula, use a light pollution map and choose an area that's far from city light. Blue and gray zones are best, but you can still see quite a few galaxies and nebula from green zones as well. And remember, you do not need dark skies to view the moon and planets. These can be viewed just as well from the city. Tip number 8. Understand the difference between stargazing and astrophotography. Now, as soon as you try to take a photo through your telescope, you've left the hobby of stargazing altogether and entered the hobby of astrophotography. Now, astrophotography is a far more challenging hobby. It's incredibly frustrating, but at the same time, it can be incredibly addictive. It takes months of practice and often thousands of dollars in gear to capture images like this, or this, or this. Most people start with their cell phone, but what can you reasonably expect to capture? Well, the moon is great for learning to use your cell phone adapter, as well as setting the focus and taking the exposures. For the planets, it's best to use your cell phone's video mode. There's a process called lucky imaging where the video is converted into a single image via a process called stacking. There are several videos here on YouTube that review this technique in great detail. For deep sky objects like nebula, it's best to wait until you have the proper gear before diving in. This includes a star tracker or a sturdy equatorial mount, one that's designed specifically for astrophotography. Tip number 9. Learn when targets are above the horizon on a given night. To determine the location of planets, use astronomy software, but rely on books to find everything else. Software tends to oversell what you're realistically able to see. Books like 110 Things to See with a Telescope typically have a limited but realistic set of targets. To locate objects visible in your evening sky, turn to the section matching the current season. If you stay up past midnight, objects from the next season will begin to rise in the east. To find planets using an app like Stellarium, open the app on your phone, hit the sensor button, and hold it up to the sky. If there are any planets above the horizon, they should be clearly marked in the app. So what can you expect to see through the telescope? You can see Venus with its phases, which look like this. Saturn looks amazing in almost any telescope, but most of the time it's still quite small in the field of view. You can see Jupiter with its 4 Galilean moons, and if the skies are steady, you should be able to make out 2 cloud belts on the surface of Jupiter, and if you're lucky, the Great Red Spot. Mars will look like a bright red star, but larger telescopes may reveal variations in the color on the surface, and a polar ice cap might be visible as well. Now, the moon is an amazing sight to see through a telescope. In fact, if you're just starting out, the moon should be your main target. Get to know the names of the lunar seas and the most prominent craters. Visiting these craters month after month will soon have them feeling like old friends. Tip number 10. It's not the telescope, it's the astronomer. New entrants to the astronomy hobby often get aperture fever, the desire for larger and larger telescopes. I know I sure did. They also get gear fever too, thinking that more eyepieces and Barlows will improve their experience. In some cases, more is better, but a seasoned astronomer can find enjoyment with any telescope, or no telescope at all. They'll often obsess over meteor showers, lunar or solar eclipses, or other astronomical events. Most are members of their local astronomy club. Stargazing for them is a very social activity.
Seasoned astronomers stargaze a little differently than most. When they find an object in the sky, they dwell on it, letting their eyes take in more and more detail the longer they observe. Seasoned astronomers tend to have goals like completing the 110 Messier object list, or the finest NGCs from Rask's Observer's Handbook. Some astronomers fall in love with observing the moon and complete observing programs like Explore the Moon or the Isabel Williamson Lunar Observing Program. If you spend enough time under the stars, before you know it, you'll be a seasoned astronomer too. Over time, you'll become sky aware. You'll always know the current phase of the moon, and you'll know what you can see from dark skies and from the city. And you'll know which objects are visible at each time of the year. But if you're just entering the hobby, don't get discouraged. There's lots of people willing to help. And never forget that quote from Helen, that the stars belong to everyone. So get out there and enjoy them.
Okay, as promised, this is how you use a robotic telescope for free to capture your very own astrophotos. These instructions can also be found at the link below. The first thing we're going to do is open Twitter and search for the Burke-Gaffney Observatory. Then we'll click Messenger. Note that Facebook Messenger works as well. The first step is to send the observatory an introductory message including the following information. #authorize, your full name, where you are located, and why you want to use the observatory. For example, for me, I would type #authorize, I am John Reed from Canada, and I want to take photos with the telescope. Now within about a day, someone at the observatory will review this message and grant you authorization to use the telescope. Now you're ready to request some images. You'll be given permission to add up to 3 images to the telescope's observing queue. To request an observation, go to Twitter Messenger and type #request, object equals, and the name of the object without any spaces. For example, if you want to take a picture of the Andromeda Galaxy, you type #request, object equals Andromeda Galaxy, with no spaces. In many cases, you may need to look up the object's designation. For example, the Andromeda Galaxy also goes by the designation M31. Without you having to do anything else, on the next clear night, the telescope will take an image of the Andromeda Galaxy with the default camera settings. To customize the camera settings to your needs, refer to the command list at the link below. Once the telescope has taken your image, it will send you the image in a Twitter message, including a link to a high-resolution file. And that's pretty much all there is to it.